We would like to thank the fun and challenging Best Fiends for their support. If you've listened to the show for a while, you know that I'm obsessed with Best Fiends. So stop crushing the same old candy and try a puzzle game with something fresh to offer. Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. And we'd also like to thank Acorn TV for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Acorn TV is the largest commercial-free British streaming service that features compelling stories, exclusive premieres, and originals you won't find anywhere else. To try Acorn TV free for 30 days, go to acorn.tv and use promo code COLD in all lowercase letters only. Thank you and enjoy the show. December 15th, 2000. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The former boss of 53-year-old Colleen Wood calls her on her cell phone to invite her to an upcoming Christmas party, but even though Colleen says she will be there, she never shows up and is not heard from again. At the time, Colleen and her boyfriend, John Paul, were planning to leave on a 5-year sailing trip around the world on John's boat, but when John is questioned about this months later, he claims that Colleen broke up with him and he has no idea where she is. However, it turns out that John has an extensive criminal history and likely stole Colleen's money, but he winds up fleeing the country, and neither John nor Colleen can be found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I'm going to be covering a missing persons case about a woman who vanished around the time she was scheduled to make a sailing trip around the world, the 2000 disappearance of Colleen Wood. Throughout the month of December, our podcast is going to be counting down to Christmas by covering cases which have some sort of connection to the holidays. The date of this episode's release marks the 21-year anniversary of the last time Colleen was confirmed to be alive, as she failed to make any contact with her friends and family over the Christmas holidays, which was very uncharacteristic of her. At the time, Colleen was involved in a serious relationship with a man named John Paul, and was so smitten with him that she was willing to quit her job and sell all her assets in order to join John on his yacht for a worldwide sailing trip which was scheduled to last 5 years. Well, even though Colleen was never heard from again, John did resurface 4 months later in order to be questioned by the authorities, but it wasn't long before he disappeared as well, and John has also not been seen in 2 decades. Even though John has never been officially classified as a suspect in this case, there were a lot of red flags with him, as he served time in prison for numerous crimes, including drug trafficking and attempted murder. There was also a lot of activity on Colleen's credit cards following her disappearance, which has led to speculation that she fell prey to a con artist who bilked her out of everything she had. But there is technically no evidence that foul play or any crime at all took place, so until John Paul can be tracked down, who knows if Colleen's loved ones will ever get conclusive answers about what happened to her. While this case has been featured on both Unsolved Mysteries and Disappeared, they barely scratched the surface about how crazy John's backstory was, and on this episode, we're also going to discuss how another spouse of his went missing under mysterious circumstances 2 decades earlier. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearance of Colleen Wood. Our story begins in Florida in 2000 and our central figure is 53-year-old Colleen Wood. Colleen originally hails from Akron, Ohio, and is the divorced mother of 2 grown sons, Michael and Todd Tanderich, whom she raised on her own. At this particular point, Michael is living in Akron with a wife and children of his own, while Todd is serving in the military. After working at an Akron hospital for over 20 years, Colleen's job was eliminated by downsizing, and her 7-year relationship with her boyfriend came to an end. So in April of 1998, she decided to get a fresh start by relocating to Florida. She moved into a condo in Boca Raton and got a new job she really liked as an office manager at the Lighthouse Point Marina in Fort Lauderdale. In November of 1999, Colleen met her current boyfriend, 61-year-old John Paul Sr., after answering a personal ad he had placed in a newspaper. John's ad captured Colleen's attention because she was passionate about sailing, and John said he owned a yacht and was looking for a sailing companion. Colleen quickly became enamored with John, who was originally born in the Netherlands before he emigrated with his family to the United States during his teen years. John went on to graduate from Harvard with a master's degree in business and became a successful mutual fund manager, which made him a millionaire. However, John's biggest passion was auto racing, and after quitting his job on Wall Street during the early 1970s, he would go on to find great success as a race car driver, winning a number of championships. In fact, John also raced alongside his son, John Paul Jr., who had a successful racing career of his own, and they even won some titles together as a father and son duo. When he met Colleen, John spent most of his time living on a 60-foot luxury schooner he owned named the Island Girl, which was docked on the New River in Fort Lauderdale. When the summer of 2000 rolled around, Colleen surprised everyone by announcing her intentions to quit her job and sell her condo, car, and most of her possessions in order to move onto John's boat with them. Colleen would be paid a salary as John's assistant, performing such jobs as remodeling the cabin, and she even trusted John to invest the $40,000 in net proceeds she had earned from her sale. According to Colleen, she and John were planning to embark on a 5-year sailing tour around the world on the Island Girl, and while her friends and family were concerned about this, Colleen believed she was fulfilling a lifelong dream. On December the 3rd, which happened to be Colleen's 53rd birthday, she received a phone call from her son Michael in Akron, and told him that she had picked out some gifts for her granddaughter's upcoming birthday and would be sending them soon. A few days later, Michael received a letter from his mother, who said she was leaving on a sailing trip to Key West with John, where they would spend Christmas together, and afterward, they would sail to the coast of Cuba to begin their 5-year voyage around the world. Colleen also mentioned that since she would be traveling on the open sea, she was planning to discontinue her cell phone service at the end of the month, but she hoped to get in touch with Michael again sometime in January. On December the 15th, one of Colleen's friends, Maureen Canada, who also happened to be her former boss at the Lighthouse Point Marina, called Colleen on her cell phone in order to invite her to an upcoming office Christmas party on the 19th. According to Maureen, Colleen said she was at a bar in Key West with John and sounded like she was in good spirits, and she confirmed that she would attend the party, but after the call ended, no one would ever hear from Colleen again. Colleen never showed up to Maureen's party or sent her granddaughter's birthday presents to Akron, and she did not even contact anyone from her family over the Christmas holidays. By mid-January of 2001, no one had heard from Colleen at all, so Michael became concerned and called her cell phone and learned that her account had been suspended on December the 28th due to lack of payment. Michael made attempts to track down the Island Girl by contacting the Coast Guard and the Federal Communications Commission, and learned that John had checked the schooner out of its boat slip at New River and departed Fort Lauderdale sometime after the new year. Since Michael did not have John's phone number, he decided to perform an internet search on him to find it, but he would learn a number of shocking things about John's background. While John's stories about being a successful mutual fund manager and race car driver were true, he also had an extensive criminal history, which Colleen likely did not know about. It turned out that John had helped finance his racing career with a lucrative drug trafficking operation. His first trouble with the law occurred in January of 1979, when John Sr., his son John Jr., and another associate were all arrested after being caught with over 1,500 pounds of marijuana in their possession, for which they would each receive a sentence of 3 years probation and were ordered to pay fines of $32,500. However, things escalated on April the 19th, 1983, when a man named Stephen Carson arrived at a boat ramp in Crescent Beach after returning from a late-night fishing trip. He was soon confronted by John Paul Sr., who attempted to force him into the trunk of his car at gunpoint. When Carson attempted to run away, John shot him a total of 5 times in the chest, abdomen, and leg before fleeing the scene. Carson had recently been given immunity for testifying before a federal grand jury in a racketeering and conspiracy case, and John was convinced that Carson had ratted him out, but miraculously, Carson wound up surviving his wounds and identified John as the shooter. In an ironic turn of events, Carson had never actually named John in front of the grand jury because he feared John would try to kill him if he did. 2 months after the shooting, John agreed to turn himself in, and after pleading not guilty to the charges against him, he was released on a $500,000 bond to await trial. However, John proceeded to flee the country until he was apprehended outside a bank in Geneva, Switzerland 1 year later. During his absence, a 17-count indictment was filed against John for heading up a massive drug trafficking ring which had transported over 200,000 pounds and millions of dollars worth of marijuana from Colombia into the United States for distribution over an 8-year period. Indictments were also handed down against 7 other people who were involved in the drug ring, including John's father, Lee Paul, and his son John Jr., who joined his family's drug business when he was still a teenager. In exchange for not testifying against his father, John Jr. agreed to a plea deal in which he pled guilty to racketeering and possessing a false passport. He received a 5-year prison sentence and was released in October of 1988. After serving a 6-month prison sentence in Switzerland for possessing a false passport, John Sr. was extradited back to the United States, and in June of 1986, he pled guilty to attempted first-degree murder and received a sentence of 20 years, which would later be expanded to 25 years after he agreed to plead guilty to additional federal charges. In an amusing sidebar, John and another inmate made an ill-fated attempt to escape from the Baker County Jail by concocting a mixture of hot sauce and pine sol and throwing it in a guard's face before they attempted to scale the fence. But since the guard was wearing glasses, he wasn't blinded too badly, and after firing a shot into the air, the 2 inmates immediately halted their climb and surrendered. Anyway, John wound up serving 13 years of his sentence before he was paroled in July of 1999, only 4 months before he met Colleen, and their planned 5-year sailing trip would have been a violation of his parole. If that wasn't enough, it turned out that John's second wife, Chalice Paul, had also gone missing without explanation during the summer of 1981. At the time, Chalice was living in Atlanta and separated from John, but he convinced her to join him in Key West in hopes of repairing their marriage. It was confirmed that Chalice boarded a flight to Florida to see John, but no one knows what happened to her afterward, and John never bothered to contact Chalice's family to let them know she was missing. Since John told the authorities that Chalice had vanished voluntarily, and there was no evidence that a crime had been committed, no missing persons report was ever officially filed for her, and no investigation was performed. John would later travel to Haiti in order to divorce Chalice in absentia so that he could get remarried. In the months following Colleen's disappearance, her family also had issues getting the police to file a missing persons report since there was no evidence she was in any danger. Colleen and John had a joint account at a mail holding service in Green Cove Springs, but while some mail was picked up shortly after Colleen was last heard from, their account was no longer being used. For this reason, Michael managed to convince the Green Cove Springs Police Department to do a cursory search for Colleen, but they were unable to find her. Since John could also not be found anywhere, Michael took the initiative to track down John's daughter, Tanya. Tanya lived in Indiana and told Michael she did not know how to contact her father, though she said that he usually called her every few weeks. According to Tanya, during one of their most recent conversations, John told her that Colleen had decided to end their relationship sometime in mid-December after getting angry over an incident with one of John's ex-girlfriends. Michael asked Tanya to tell her father to call him the next time she heard from him, and sure enough, 3 days later, Michael received a phone call from John, who said he was currently sailing in Europe. He shared a story which was similar to the one Tanya had told Michael, though it had some differences. John claimed that he and Colleen had gotten into a heated argument, and while he said he couldn't remember what the argument was about, it was serious enough to prompt Colleen to leave his boat. A few days later, Colleen returned to the boat to collect her belongings and was accompanied by 2 men whom John described as quote-unquote football player types. John believed that one of the men may have been Colleen's new boyfriend, but he maintained that this was the last time he ever saw Colleen, and he left Fort Lauderdale a short time later. By this point, it was late April of 2001, and Colleen had not been seen for 4 months, so Michael finally managed to convince the Fort Lauderdale Police Department to file a missing persons report for her. Investigators soon discovered that over 80 cash advances had been made on Colleen's credit card at various ATMs throughout Fort Lauderdale, which started on December the 18th, 2000, and continued on until February of 2001. The advances totaled around $40,000, and a check of the surveillance photos from the cameras at these ATMs revealed that 2 younger women besides Colleen had used her cards to make the transactions. In addition, one of the credit cards had been used to place a pair of ads in a Florida newspaper. One of them was a help wanted ad for a first mate on a boat, and the other was a personal ad placed by a male named George, who was seeking the company of a female for an upcoming sailing trip. Most disturbingly, the personal ad had been placed on December the 16th, the day after Colleen was last confirmed to be alive during her phone call with Maureen Canada. Investigators also checked Colleen's cell phone records and discovered that her phone had not been used to make or receive any calls after December the 15th. The 2 detectives assigned to the case learned that the Island Girl was being stored in a dry dock facility located about 50 miles outside Key West, which obviously seemed to go against John's story to Michael that he was off sailing in Europe. On April the 30th, the detectives finally crossed paths with John when he arrived at the dry dock facility to retrieve his boat. John was very cooperative when he was questioned, and maintained that he had not seen Colleen since mid-December and had no idea of her current whereabouts. While John stuck to his original story that Colleen had ended their relationship and returned to his boat with 2 unidentified men to retrieve her belongings, he changed one key detail, now claiming that the argument with Colleen was financially motivated, as he said he had lent her money to pay off some credit card debt before the sale of her condo, and she broke up with him rather than pay him back. The detectives noticed that even though John appeared to be nervous during their questioning, he also seemed to be very indifferent and unconcerned about Colleen's disappearance. In spite of this, John was not considered to be a suspect, though investigators soon learned that he had not made any of his scheduled visitations with his parole officer in 2 months, though John had written him a letter expressing his intention to leave the country. John was considered to be in violation of his parole, but due to a backlog, this information had not yet been entered into the system at the time he was first interviewed by detectives. If it had been, they would have had grounds to detain John and search the Island Girl. When detectives learned about John's parole violation, they returned to the dry dock facility, but learned that the Island Girl was now gone, and John could not be located either, as he had apparently sailed off somewhere the day after he was interviewed. However, investigators were able to locate the 2 women who had been photographed using Colleen's credit cards, and they both claimed they had been approached by a man who wanted them to withdraw money from a number of different ATMs on his behalf. He provided them with Colleen's cards and PIN numbers and told them they could keep 10 to 20% of the money they withdrew while he pocketed the rest. The 2 women would identify this man as John Paul. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in August of 2002, where the authorities confirmed that while John Paul was not wanted for any crime, they still wanted to track him down for further questioning. After the episode aired, investigators received a number of tips that John was living in Montego Bay, Jamaica, but they were unable to locate him. However, following a rerun of the Unsolved Mysteries segment in 2004, a viewer phoned the tip line to claim that they recognized John, who was now living in Fiji and had changed the name of his boat from the Island Girl to the Diamond Girl. When Michael Tanderich was interviewed about this on an episode of Disappeared in 2012, he said he was told that federal marshals were able to locate John, but were powerless to do anything, since Fiji does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. Well, I'm not sure this statement is entirely accurate, but I'll talk more about this later on in this episode. But there would be a new development in the investigation when a female acquaintance of John's who had spent time with him on his boat in Fiji decided to come forward. The woman claimed she had become suspicious of John and his connections to Colleen's disappearance, so she took the initiative to grab a laptop he had on board and brought it to the authorities in the United States. They were able to determine that the laptop had belonged to Colleen, and that she kept a record of all her credit cards and PIN numbers stored on there, which would explain how John was able to make so many cash advances on the card. John eventually departed Fiji, and there would be more reported sightings of him at various ports throughout Europe. The last confirmed sighting of John took place in Thailand in 2009, where he supposedly discussed plans to open up a dive shop, and he reportedly sold his boat 2 years later. If John is still alive, he would be 82 years old today, and possibly living in Thailand or his home country of the Netherlands. Incidentally, John Paul Jr. would develop the neurological disorder Huntington's disease, and after a long struggle with the illness, he passed away in December of 2020 at the age of 60. Prior to his death, John Jr. confirmed that he had not heard from his father since he left the United States 2 decades earlier. John Paul Sr.'s whereabouts are still unknown, and there are no conclusive answers about what actually happened to Colleen Wood. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, before we continue, I would like to take another moment to give a shout out to Best Fiends. If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you'll know that I'm obsessed with playing Best Fiends year-round, but I especially love playing it during the holiday season when I'm trapped indoors because of our cold Canadian winters. Preparing for the holidays can also be a very busy and stressful situation, but Best Fiends provides the perfect pick-me-up when you need a break for the holiday action. Best Fiends is a game that has it all, including an amazing storyline, collectible fiends, and tons of fun puzzles. I've already said many times that it's quite possibly the best puzzle game out there, and I cannot put it down. No Wi-Fi? No problem. You can play Best Fiends whenever and wherever you want with offline mode. Even if your holiday travels take you off the beaten path, you can still play Best Fiends. I mean, I've been playing it for over 2 years now, and not to brag or anything, but I recently passed level 2300, and if all goes according to plan, I might reach the magical milestone of level 2500 by the next time we speak. And since Best Fiends has literally thousands of levels with more added all the time, there's always a fresh challenge waiting whenever you need a mental pick-me-up. So download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. And we would also like to take a few moments to thank Acorn TV. I'm sure it's hard to believe that the holidays are right around the corner, as it's my favorite time of the year, and one reason to relish the holidays is because I have a bunch of extra time to watch some amazing TV. And many of the shows I love most are on Acorn TV. Acorn TV is the largest commercial-free British streaming service that features compelling stories, exclusive premieres, and originals you won't find anywhere else. There's always something new to discover since it has hundreds of exclusive shows from around the world, including award-winning mysteries, dramas, and so much more. You'll get thousands of hours of new, enthralling content on Acorn TV for a fraction of the cost compared to most streaming services at just $5.99 a month. Acorn TV is very easy to stream on your favorite device, and I would now like to recommend another great new series they have recently launched. The other series I've recommended in the past had a crime element to them, but today I'm making a nice change of pace by recommending a humorous romantic drama series named Under the Vines, which recently made its US and Canada debut exclusively on Acorn TV. It stars Rebecca Gibney and Charles Edwards as two unlikely city slickers who inherit a failing vineyard in rural New Zealand, even though they despise each other. Both these characters are escaping a spiraling series of unfortunate events in their lives, and neither of them have ever done a hard day's work, but they somehow must make this winery successful so they can sell up, split up, and get out. Under the Vines is just one of the many excellent pieces of content you'll find on this streaming service. So try Acorn TV free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and use promo code COLD in all lowercase letters. That's acorn.tv with promo code COLD in all lowercase letters only to get your first 30 days for free. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So unsolved missing persons cases are painful enough, but they're particularly frustrating when the person who is believed to have the answers about what happened to the victim also vanishes without a trace. It would be one thing if that individual was a fugitive with an active arrest warrant, because then they might be easier to track down, but it's a complicated situation when there's no evidence that a crime has been committed and they are technically only wanted for questioning. As an example, last month I covered another case from Florida, about the 1994 disappearances of Moses Lal and Lila Buritan, where one of their employees, Harry Goben, did a number of suspicious things and was believed to have knowledge about what happened to them, but he also went missing at the same time they did, and even though the authorities have come close to tracking him down on a few occasions, they've never actually been able to detain him for questioning. The problem is that Goben has not been charged with any crime, and has managed to stay under the radar for 3 decades, and it's believed that this case will never be solved unless he is found and can provide some answers. The same logic applies to John Paul Sr., because even though it's really easy to believe that he was personally involved in Colleen Wood's disappearance, there is no direct evidence of foul play. Technically, he has not even been classified as a suspect by law enforcement, only a person of interest. While John did violate his parole when he left the country, he has not been charged with any new crimes, and what further complicated matters is that John owned a schooner, which would have made it easier for him to travel to other countries undetected. It sounds like Colleen's family has come to terms with the fact that she is most likely dead, but there's a frustrating feeling that the authorities will never be able to conclusively solve the case unless John Paul can be found. It would be one thing if it was conclusively proven that John murdered Colleen and managed to evade justice these past 2 decades, but her loved ones don't even have a body or a final resting place for her. This is an incredibly tragic story because it sounds like Colleen was finally getting to fulfill some lifelong dreams as she moved to Florida, got a new job she liked, and met a man whom she fell head over heels in love with. It seemed like the perfect circumstances for Colleen to spend her twilight years, but unfortunately, she did not know about John's shady history, and it's apparent that she was completely taken in by the charms of a devious con artist. While Colleen's friends and family have all described her as a genuinely nice, kind-hearted person, they've also acknowledged that she was very trusting and missed out on what they believed were some major red flags. They advised Colleen that it might be a bad idea for her to quit her job, sell her condo, liquidate her assets, and pretty much put all her money in John's hands for this 5-year sailing trip around the world. But Colleen said this trip was one of those things that she had always wanted to do, and since she thought she might never get another opportunity like this, she was willing to cast all these concerns aside. Now, I first became familiar with this case on Unsolved Mysteries, who aired it less than 2 years after Colleen went missing, and while they did acknowledge John Paul's past criminal history, they did not treat him as a wanted fugitive or suspect, only reiterating that the authorities wanted to find and question him again. By the time the Disappeared episode aired 10 years later, John had still not been tracked down and was treated with a lot more suspicion. It seemed apparent that the authorities had a bad feeling about John from the very start, but I wonder if they downplayed this a little bit on Unsolved Mysteries in hopes that perhaps John might feel more comfortable returning to the United States and be caught off guard. However, one significant detail that neither of these episodes mentioned is that one of John's previous wives, Chalice Paul, had also gone missing under suspicious circumstances 2 decades earlier, which adds another significant layer to the story. You will not find Chalice Paul's name on the Charlie Project or NamUs or the Doe Network because law enforcement technically never filed a missing persons report for her back in 1981, and I'm not sure they ever have. We know that Chalice boarded a flight in Atlanta in order to go see John in Florida and never returned, but back then, it was much more difficult to convince the authorities to investigate the disappearances of adults if there was no direct evidence of foul play, and they thought there was a decent chance they took off voluntarily. Chalice's disappearance never got any media coverage at the time, but if you go to newspapers.com and do a search on her previous married name, Chalice Barnett, she is mentioned in a few articles from May of 1980, as she got married to John at a ceremony which took place at Lime Rock Park in Lakeville, Connecticut, right before John participated in the Coca-Cola 400 race. The whole ceremony was treated as a major spectacle, as John landed in a nearby field in a helicopter before traveling to the altar on a motorcycle. What's ironic is that Chalice's previous husband was a huge racing fan and was the one who introduced her to John until she decided to leave her husband for him. The only reason we even know that Chalice is a missing person is because a former friend of hers named Lisa Colom Gandolfo decided to start a website for her at chalicepaul.com, which goes into detail about Chalice's failed marriage to John. According to the website, the marriage seemed to be a disaster from the start, since Chalice caught John in bed with another woman on their honeymoon. Even though Chalice had worked as a flight attendant at Delta Airlines for 15 years, she wound up losing her job after John threw a major temper tantrum at an airport while they were traveling together. After they separated and Chalice moved to Atlanta, it seemed like John had convinced her to give the relationship another try, and that they could patch things up with a second honeymoon if she came to see him in Florida. But of course, after she left, Chalice was never heard from again. Last year, Lisa Colomb Gandolfo released a multi-episode podcast titled Chalice Paul Disappeared, The True Story, and while I haven't had a chance to listen to the whole thing, it sounds like it goes into a lot more detail about Chalice's disappearance. This particular episode is going to be focused more on Colleen Wood, but I'm sure it goes without saying that it seems incredibly suspicious that John would have two different spouses go missing 2 decades apart. I could probably do an entire podcast series about the colorful life of John Paul Sr., but I don't want to take too much focus away from Colleen's story. I know that Colleen's son Michael found out about John's criminal history when he did an internet search on him after she went missing, and it seems like John Paul Sr. has become so infamous that he now has his own Wikipedia page, which goes into extensive detail about his racing career and criminal activities, and it even has a brief section which covers Colleen's disappearance. Interestingly enough, the Wikipedia page also has a section labeled Behavior, which discusses the notorious temper tantrums that John was known for. It includes a quote from an International Motorsports Association official who stated, quote, "Senior is the most terrifying man I have ever met. Temper tantrums and wild outbursts are pretty commonplace in racing, but Senior's extend way beyond that. He is more than frightening, he is scary." End quote. Indeed, John's temper was also present during his relationship with Colleen, because even though he could be a charming guy at times, he was prone to having some pretty violent tantrums when he was angry, particularly if he had been drinking too much. Colleen was aware of John's volatile tendencies, but had learned to accept them, as she decided to implement a swear jar for him. Every time John used profanity or was verbally abusive, Colleen would make him put $5 into the jar, as she hoped this would encourage him to manage his anger. Colleen's friends and family were also aware of John's temper, and you can understand why they would be concerned about her making a round-the-world sailing trip with someone like that. If he were to become angry, violent, and abusive on a 60-foot schooner in the middle of the ocean, it's not like she would have anywhere to go to escape from him. While it's bad enough that John had previously been involved in drug trafficking, he also served time in prison for attempted murder, and it sounds like it's only through pure luck that his victim, Stephen Carson, wound up surviving. John shot him a total of 5 times, and seemed to have every intention of killing him, which demonstrates that he was capable of murder. Had Carson not survived his wounds, John might have spent a lot more time in prison, and never gotten the opportunity to cross paths with Colleen to begin with. So in addition to the attempted murder of Stephen Carson and the disappearances of Chalice Paul and Colleen Wood, there has been speculation that John also could have been involved in the disappearance of a third person named David Casoria, who is alleged to have been John's co-leader in the marijuana trafficking ring. Casoria was one of the 8 individuals from the ring who had indictments handed down against him, but according to numerous newspaper articles from that time period, Casoria could not be tracked down, and the last time he was confirmed to be alive was 1983, the same year when John shot Stephen Carson. As far as I can tell, Casoria was never found, and while I'm not sure if there's any real evidence that John made him disappear, I could certainly believe he was capable of it. Another unresolved mystery is why John seemed to have a ton of money in his possession when he became involved with Colleen. During their relationship, they lived a high-class lifestyle, and John was always lavishing her with expensive gifts, even though, as far as anyone could tell, he had no real job, and I'd assume that all of his assets from his drug trafficking would have been seized when he went to prison. We do know that following his release, John briefly lived with his son, John Jr., and it's believed that he used John Jr. to access some financial accounts, though it doesn't sound like investigators were able to figure out where this money came from in the first place. But it does give off the impression that John Sr. may have had money stashed somewhere, which allowed him to travel around the world while eluding the authorities. Speaking of John Jr., he was able to successfully resume his racing career following his release from prison in 1988, though his criminal record made it difficult for him to secure lucrative sponsorships. His struggles with Huntington's disease eventually forced him to retire, and a book about his life titled 50/50, the story of champion race driver John Paul Jr. and his battle with Huntington's disease, was published in 2018. But even though John Jr.'s issues with the disease were well documented, it does not sound like John Sr. made any attempt to return to the US to see him, and until he passed away last year, John Jr. maintained that he never heard from his father after he left the country in 2001. You could take this as an indication that John Sr. is now deceased, but he also sounds like such a sociopathic individual that not even the personal struggles and death of his own son would compel him to resurface and risk potential capture. So now let's start talking about the circumstances of Colleen's disappearance. We know that the last time Colleen was confirmed to be alive was on December the 15th, 2000, when her former boss, Maureen Canada, called Colleen on her cell phone while she was at a bar in Key West with John. After that, we have no idea if Colleen ever made it out of Key West alive, but since all the activity on her cell phone pretty much came to a halt after this, it does seem like there's a good chance something happened to Colleen a relatively short time following the call. The Christmas party took place on the 19th, and Colleen did not attend or bother to contact Maureen, and she also did not send her granddaughter the birthday gift she had promised, or made any attempt to reach out to her family on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. I think the strongest evidence that Colleen did not live past the 15th is that her credit card was used to purchase some personal ads which ran in the newspaper on the 16th, and one of them was written by a man named George, who was specifically asking for a female companion for an upcoming sailing trip. While John's name was never used in the ad, this pretty much mirrors the exact circumstances of how he met Colleen 1 year earlier, as she met him through a personal ad while he was looking for a sailing companion. It was also only a few days later, on December the 18th, when a bunch of cash advances started getting made on Colleen's credit cards at ATMs, and over the course of the next 2 months, around $40,000 was withdrawn. Let's also not forget that Colleen had previously given the $40,000 in net proceeds she had made from the sale of her condo to John in order for him to invest, but if he was also behind the ATM withdrawals, John would have made over $80,000 from Colleen's disappearance. Now, I have to admit that when this case was first profiled on Unsolved Mysteries, and they mentioned that another woman, maybe two, had made the cash advances on Colleen's cards, I wondered who these women could have been, and how they fit into this whole situation. It was not until the Disappeared episode came out a decade later, when it was finally revealed that these two women were tracked down, and revealed that a man had hired them to make the withdrawals for a cut of the money. They apparently identified this man as John, though it's unclear if they had known him personally or if he just picked them out at random. Given the circumstances, it is surprising that an arrest warrant was not issued against John for credit card fraud, as Colleen's laptop was found in his possession years later, and since all of her credit card and PIN numbers were saved on there, this would explain how he was able to use her cards after she went missing. If John was the man who orchestrated this, and I think it's very likely he was, then this was one of the most diabolical, calculated parts of his plan, since he likely knew the ATMs were being covered by surveillance cameras, so he had to ensure that he was not photographed withdrawing the money himself. It takes a lot of patience to make over 80 withdrawals over the course of 2 months, but I'm sure there was a limit on the amount of cash advances which could be made each day. What worked to John's advantage is that everyone believed Colleen was on a worldwide sailing trip where she would be out of contact for long periods of time, so no one was actively searching for her while John remained in Fort Lauderdale, slowly draining her accounts. If John was the guilty party, one of the biggest unanswered questions in this case is whether he always planned on killing Colleen as part of an elaborate con job to take her money, or if this was a crime of passion where John killed her in the heat of the moment and had to cover up the crime. Well, given John's documented issues with having a volatile temper, the second option is certainly possible, but there's also evidence which points to this being a premeditated murder plot. I think it goes without saying that no one really believes John's cover story that Colleen broke up with him and returned to his boat a few days later with 2 unidentified men in order to collect her belongings, and he never saw her again. Putting aside the fact that John changed details about this story every time he shared it, everyone who knew Colleen said it would have been very uncharacteristic of her to break off all contact with them and not even attempt to speak with her family over the holidays. So unless by some miracle, these 2 men who accompanied Colleen to the boat actually existed and later killed her themselves, I think it's safe to say that John's story is bogus. And remember, Colleen had given John $43,000 of her own money to invest on her behalf, so don't you think she would have asked for it back if they broke up? Also, in the version of this story John shared with investigators, he claimed that Colleen ended the relationship because he had loaned her money to pay off some credit card debt and she refused to pay it back. But if she had already made $43,000 from her condo sale and gave it to John, why would she owe him money? Everyone who spoke to John also said he seemed very unconcerned when he learned Colleen was missing and had not been seen in months, which is a very strange reaction to have about a woman he purportedly loved and had been in a one-year relationship with. You have to wonder if John ever had any intention of making this 5-year sailing trip around the world with Colleen, or if he just made the whole thing up in order to provide a convenient excuse for her to be out of contact for a while so no one would notice she was missing. It seemed like Colleen was completely unaware that John had served time in prison and that embarking on a trip like this would have been a violation of his parole, so it may have been nothing more than a cover story. Now that John had obtained the net proceeds from Colleen liquidating her assets, and he had all the information about her credit card accounts on her laptop, he may have figured that she had outlived her usefulness and decided to get rid of her. Now, one of the most confusing aspects of this case for me is that John was tracked down in Fiji in 2004, and federal marshals reportedly had eyes on him and confirmed his location, but he was never detained or taken into custody. Like I mentioned earlier, when Michael Tanderich was interviewed on the Disappeared episode, he said that he was told there was nothing the authorities could do since Fiji does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. But that's not entirely true, since both nations signed an extradition agreement and put it into force during the 1930s. I'm admittedly not an expert on these sorts of legal technicalities, but I have to wonder if the complication might be that John is technically only wanted for a parole violation, not for any new crimes he committed after he was released from prison in 1999. According to the treaty, quote, extradition is available for an offense that is punishable in the requesting state by death or imprisonment of at least 12 months or life, and if the conduct underlying the request, if committed in Fiji, is punishable there by imprisonment of 12 months or life, end quote. I'm not sure if extradition is applicable to parole violations, so perhaps John cannot be detained for that unless he sets foot on U.S. soil again. Of course, I'd argue that hiring 2 women to make unauthorized cash advances on Colleen's credit cards should be grounds to file new charges against John, but perhaps the testimony from these 2 women who identified him is not considered to be strong enough evidence. However, if Colleen's body was found, or new evidence surfaced to prove that she was a victim of foul play, then John could theoretically be charged with her murder and brought back to the United States, provided that he's not hiding out in a non-extradition treaty country. The last confirmed sighting of John took place in Thailand, and they do have an extradition agreement with the US, but one of the biggest obstacles against filing murder charges against John is that Colleen's remains could be anywhere. She was last confirmed to be alive in Key West, but we can't even be certain that she was killed there, and since she lived with John on his boat, he most likely dumped her into a body of water somewhere, and who knows where they could even begin searching for her. We also can't even be 100% certain that John is still alive, as it's been over 10 years since his last confirmed sighting, and he will be turning 83 years old this coming March. If he died of natural causes in some foreign country, would the American authorities even find out about it? At the end of the Disappeared episode, both Michael and the investigators hinted that at this particular point in time, they no longer even care that much about bringing John to justice, but they at least want him to make contact in order to reveal the truth about what happened to Colleen. I mean, this all could just be a ploy in hopes of luring John out into the open, but if John did not even bother to make contact with his own son during his struggles with Huntington's disease or resurface following John Jr.'s death, then the odds of him surrendering or making a confession about the disappearance of Colleen or the disappearance of his ex-wife, Chalice Paul, are not great. Overall, this is a case where there only seems to be one real theory to explain what happened. I just cannot come to any other conclusion other than John Paul being responsible for the disappearance of Colleen Wood, as none of the potential alternate theories make any sense at all. John's constantly changing stories, and the fact that he orchestrated the usage of Colleen's credit cards following her disappearance shows that he was most likely the perpetrator, but whether the whole thing was planned and premeditated, or him covering up a crime of passion, is still up for debate. Prior to Colleen, we have 1, potentially 2 unsolved missing persons cases which have been linked to John, and we know that he shot Stephen Carson multiple times simply because he believed he ratted him out, even though this turned out not to be true. This act only demonstrates that John is a ruthless human being who has no qualms about eliminating anyone whom he considers to be an obstacle. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Colleen Wood or the current whereabouts of John Paul Sr., please contact the Fort Lauderdale Police Department at 954-828-5517. That's 954-828-5517. And if you also happen to have any information about the disappearance of Chalice Paul, please contact the authorities about that as well. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. I just released a bonus episode about a controversial unsolved mysteries case of a missing Marine named Kurt Borton, who was supposedly killed in action during the Vietnam War, but his family became convinced he survived and returned to the United States. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the unsolved 1971 disappearance of Lynn Schulze, whose case has been linked to recently convicted murderer Robert Durst. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Sherry H., Angie D., Meredith P., and Maya C. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to get a discount. So to receive a 10% discount off a standard badge, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's crimecon.com and the promo code is TRAIL. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the ear music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.